today's webinar, which is on the co-chairs panel that took place in January to enable some reflections on that panel and to have a panel discussion on potential criteria for assessing DSI policy options. We will be together some 120 minutes. We are offering for this webinar, which will be held in English, French, and Spanish translation. For those who did not enter this meeting via a browser, but through the app, they have then the opportunity to use one of the channels. They are at the bottom of the screen, so please use the channel of your choice, English, French, or Spanish. And we are also having the feature of a Q&A box. This box is open for all participants, and it is particularly meant to collect questions and comments. We will not be able to answer them in this very webinar, but as this is to be seen in a series of webinars to come, we will try to pick up on your comments and questions, and you can use this Q&A box when pushing the bottom at the bottom, the button at the bottom of your screen. And if you like and agree to comments and questions of others, there is also this like function which you may use, so then we can maybe see what kind of questions, comments are then supported or of interest by many. The webinar will also be recorded in English, French, and Spanish, so there will be an opportunity to listen to it also at a later stage. And we will make it available at the website of the ABS Capacity Development Initiative. To make it a little bit more interactive, we are having 2 polls, at least this is the plan. Right now, for example, where you will be asked some questions on the composition of the webinar, so which country group you're coming from, and also which sector you are representing. So you are invited now to fill out this very quick poll. We will make that information, of course, then available to all of us. And then we can also see which regions and which sectors are well represented and which less. At the end of the webinar, we will also provide an opportunity for a survey with some evaluation questions, where you then can share your views, suggestions. So please don't shut off and leave the webinar without filling this questionnaire. It can only help to improve substance and qualities in the forthcoming webinars. All right, so in terms of substance and framing, you all know that COP14 has acknowledged the divergences of opinions in relation to digital sequence information and called for a science policy process and further consultation. And this webinar, in the context of the partnership between Norway and South Africa and the ABS initiative, is trying to facilitate this very process with dialogues, webinars, studies, and so on. It's to be seen in a series of global webinars on digital sequence information. There were 3 organized by the Secretariat, one in collaboration with the ABS initiative in the preparation of the Working Group 3. And today's informal webinar is meant to provide a reflection of the last of these 3 global webinars, on the co-chairs webinars on policy options, and as such to support the current formal and formal process regarding DSI in the spirit of the COP decisions from Sharm el-Sheikh. So the structure of the webinar will be after the introduction and some explanations of the objectives of the webinar, that our panelists will be introduced by our facilitator, Dr. Tim Hodges, who is a professor at the McGill University in Montreal, but many of you may know him as the former co-chair of the ABS working group that then led to the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol. So after the round of presentation of panelists, we will provide a little bit of background recall where we're coming from with respect to the policy options, and then we'll enter into a roundtable discussion with 3 different phases, which build on each other, and of course, finally, a wrap up and a little bit of an outlook. So in this regard, I would now like to hand over to Tim, and yes, please introduce the panelists and provide some more framing. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Suel. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to act as a facilitator for this, this important webinar. I'll try and speak more slowly than usual, given that we have interpretation underway. As Suel mentioned, we've got 3 phases in the actual substantive portion of the webinar. And I will describe each phase in turn as we proceed through the agenda. But essentially, we're trying to effect a more dynamic discussion today than is normal in these virtual settings. And we'll see how that works. This is, of course, as you know, an informal session, and that provides us with an opportunity to be a little bit more creative, I think, and a little bit more dynamic. The broad objective of today's webinar is really to identify a landing zone or some landing zones, ultimately for safeguarding DSI flow and the sharing of benefits. This, of course, is, as I said, informal, but ultimately we're trying to identify ways of evaluating the policy options, which we will describe as has been outlined in previous webinars, ultimately for the consideration of parties and, of course, importantly, stakeholders. So this is an informal exchange among genuine experts, and as you know, many of the names and your faces in the panel, you'll acknowledge that they have very extensive expertise. And we're really pleased to have them here today. As will be noted by Hartmut Meyer from the initiative shortly, we've got essentially 6 main options, policy options, on how to proceed with DSI, including with some variants. So those options have been developed by the Secretariat and in consultation with the OEWG co-chairs. And they're important options, and they try to make some order out of a somewhat complex series of interests and issues. We won't be specifically constraining today's panelists to those options. They can feel free to go well beyond them or not even reference them at all. For after all, these options are baskets, and they're meant to clarify and be helpful, but we're not constrained by the current set of options, as has been acknowledged by the co-chairs of the OEWG on the previous webinar. Let me just say a few overarching words about policymaking and the policymaking context in regards to DSI. From my standpoint as a policymaker, former policymaker, I see this webinar and the discussions of DSI essentially about DSI. Yes, of course. But that's not the ultimate policy objective of the DSI discussions, particularly in the context of the CBD. That's the subject matter. But in fact, in my mind, the policy objective is even bigger than the critical decisions that will be made at COP in Kunming when we get there. And that policy option is related to the policy objective, which in my mind is about biodiversity, about fulfilling the 3 objectives of the CBD. And truly, ultimately, from everyone's standpoint, surely it's about the survival of our planet. So that's very, very high stakes indeed. And DSI, again, is important in its own right for a range of reasons, as is the post-global biodiversity framework. But ultimately, we are looking at the most serious of all issues. So I do hope you keep that in mind, not just as panelists, but also those who are participating in the webinar today. So it's my pleasure to introduce the following 5 internationally recognized experts, which will be leading us through a very wide-ranging and I think interesting discussion today. Let me do this in alphabetical order. We have Margot Bagley, professor at Emory University School of Law in Atlanta, Georgia, USA. Margot is also a friend of the chair of the WIPO IGC process, and you'll know her from many previous sessions. We have Alejandro Lego. Alex is the manager of the UNDP GEF ABS project in Panama City, Panama. And as you likely know, he's a former negotiator of the Nagoya Protocol from Spain. Paul Oldham is director of One World Analytics in the UK. He is also honorary science research fellow at Manchester University's Institute of Innovation Research. Henri Novillon is advisor of ABS compliant value chains, and he's also the former director of Genetic Heritage Brazil. Finally, we have Siva Thambisetti, who's the associate professor of law at the Department of Law at LSE, London School of Economics, and observer of the negotiations of BBNJ, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, under the UNGA. We're really pleased to have you with us today. This should be terrific. I'm hoping this is quite informal, and I'm sure it'll be very informative. Just a reminder that we're looking to you as experts to think openly and creatively during the session, and I know we can count on all of you to do that. So let's now move to Hartmut Meyer to provide an overview, some background information and presentation.
Well, I'm Hartmut Meyer. I'm the team leader of ABS Capacity Development Initiative, and I'm happy to inform you about some background around this webinar. As you know, it is a follow-up webinar to the co-chairs panel, which happened recently, and where DSI policy options were presented, which were developed out of various publications and contributions by experts worldwide, and also where potential criteria for the assessment of these options were presented. So I think, and this should be the overarching topic of this and the future webinars on DSI. So I think the question is, how can we contribute to resolve the divergences around DSI? I'd just like to remind you briefly on what the last CBD COP has decided, and that has also already, as we know, decided by all parties. So all parties noted that there is a divergence of views, but they also, the decision noted that all parties commit to working towards resolving this divergence. And therefore, parties decided to establish a science and policy-based process. I think this is a very straightforward decision. It's not on content, it's on process, and that's exactly where we are now. We contribute to this process and see what we can do to resolve these divergences. So just to reflect a bit on what happened until now. So I think from the contribution we saw in writing and studies, and also in other online events, we can expect that DSI will play a major role in the negotiations of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And we also see that the process until now created the basis for significant advancement in awareness and understanding of the issue. And based on the results of the various studies, we see that there are two phases of using DSI which should be addressed by any solution which is decided upon in the future. So there is the one phase where DSI is directly generated from the GR, and depending on countries and legal frameworks, this can be done under pick and mat, and then a first user might sequence DNA or proteins that is depicted here, and use the results for scientific publications, non-commercial publications, or also use it for commercial research and eventually some commercial products. So this latter is depicted by this little trolley here. Then in both cases, or generally, the DSI can go to data banks, international data banks, which are public and open. And then the second phase of use of DSI starts according to our analysis. It's the access in databases. And this access can happen worldwide by many users, and a single user can access many different DSIs, etc., etc. And then again, research and development with this information can take place. DNA or proteins could be resynthesized or determined or analyzed, whatever. And again, non-commercial and commercial research and eventually products could be generated. So this is the framework of, let's say, the DSI world, which can be seen and analyzed from the various studies we produced, this process produced until now. Just a very quick overview about the options which were presented by the co-chair. This is, I took these slides from the Secretariat and co-chair's presentation and made them a bit leaner and simpler. So just, there is the option 0, which describes the status quo, that parties have not agreed how to address DSI at the international level. And that also means that some parties may decide to include DSI measures in their domestic ABS system, as some parties already do. Then we have an option number 1, that DSI is fully integrated into the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. And that would also mean it is fully under the bilateral approach and subject to each country's legislation as genetic resources are. That means that in the end, DSI is seen as more or less equivalent to genetic resources. In how to address it legally, there need to be ABS contracts, MATs negotiated for DSI access, and user need to comply with multiple different ABS systems and requirements as it is today with genetic resources. The option 2 is there are not individual MATs, but there is a standard MAT. And the standard MAT is then on certain benefit sharing that is triggered by events through the value chain. This could be like granting of IPRs or commercialization of a product, and it would require downstream monitoring of the use of DSI. And there are 2 basic variations of this option 2, that either each country has a standard MAT, and then you would to follow this standard MAT if you are a user of the DSI from that country. And the example is the new Brazilian ABS legislation from 2015, where such a system would put in place. The second sub-option is there is an international standard MAT that would, as it is, for example, now in the International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources and Food and Agriculture, such with regard to DSI, such an international standard could be integrated in the DSA databases, and then the users of DSA need to follow that. They could be integrated in the IPR systems, and we think that there could be more possibilities to realize this option too. The third option, which was extracted from the various contributions, is that access is not restricted per se by any PIC on neither level. And that means that some type of payments or contributions should then go into a multilateral fund. So the option 3 is then focusing on multilateral approaches and not any longer on bilateral approaches. There also is no tracing then of origin, of course, the benefit sharing should go to funds. Also, option 3 has like 2 sub-options. It is in the studies and very contributions, it was described that there could be like payments for accessing the DSI, like membership fees or payments for individual access. And the option 3.2 refers to other payments and contributions. There could be payments for DSI related services. So if cloud analytics are used or sequencing equipment is bought, a small share of the costs for that is then brought into a multilateral fund. And we could also think about levies on products which are associated with DSI. So drugs, seeds, or enzymes produced with the use of DSI then would trigger benefit sharing and payment in these funds. Voluntary or other contributions to a fund were also mentioned, and several other options. I think I don't need to go into detail here. The option number 4 is enhanced technical scientific operation. That means that there is essentially not a specific benefit sharing on a product or on the use of DSI, but there is contribution to capacity development that developing country can actually use the DSI for own research and development. There are many forms how this option could be realized, research collaborations, etc. And also it was noted that, of course, this option 4 can also be element of all the other policy options. The last option, number 5, as presented by the co-chairs, was that there is no benefit sharing from DSI. That is essentially also a description of the current situation when DSI is accessed in data banks, because there are usually no benefit sharing conditions on that. That is when DSI is not considered equal to genetic resources, and the obligations under the CBD and Nagoya Protocol don't come in at all. So this is a quick overview about the 6 options. We had an option 0 in the beginning, presented by the co-chairs, and on the webpage of the Secretariat, you find all the background material if you are interested in further information. And now I go to the second part. Of course, developing and negotiating options is the one thing, but what we see as equally important is to develop sound criteria to assess these different options, because in the end there need to be a decision-making process that should be based on solid and good criteria. As Sul already mentioned, during the first global DSI dialogue, which was convened in Pretoria, the participant brainstormed on such a non-exhaustive open list. And that is something we like to use also in this webinar to give the panelists the opportunity to think on options, to think on elements of the options through the eyes of various stakeholders, and to see what points to consider might be very important for certain stakeholders. They are clustered in 7 boxes. So we have points for considerations on the deliverables. For example, a very important point for consideration, in my opinion, would be, do these options have potential to generate benefits? Will they enhance the ability to meet the SDGs, etc.? Then, of course, governance aspects are of major importance. A main question would be, for example, are the options enforceable? Yeah. And are they inclusive? Do the options in the end include the views of all stakeholders? That would be something we discuss. Also, then more on the operational level, it has to be ensured that whatever option or combination of option is chosen in the end, that they need to work for the different type of users, because there are very different users of DSI, as we know. And also because of some pressure to show that benefits can flow. If that is decided, is there a possibility to implement these options rather quickly? Economic aspects are also of big importance. First, of course, it is about the system itself. If there is a decision on whatever system in the future, questions on cost of setting it up and maintaining have to be considered, because whatever happens with these data banks, it will cost money. And of course, then on a different level, it is the economics of information have to be considered. So we know that this information, they just can spread easily. It's almost unstoppable in now the world of the internet to keep them limited to a certain group of users when they are available. And these aspects are also important to assess options. Potential impacts, of course, one very important question is, whatever options are discussed or later chosen upon, would they disrupt the open access? That's something which I think in general the stakeholders would not support, not from any field, as we know from various other webinars and publications, and would a certain option put up barriers to attaining the SDGs? That is, for example, something that also need to be addressed. There are more points for consideration in terms of capacity development and other aspects. So that is a quick overview here. As said before, you can read more about that in the links on the Secretariat's webpage on this webinar. Well, with that, I like to end my quick introduction and give back the word to Tim.
Thanks very much, Hartmut, for the very clear and succinct presentation about the two core elements underlying this morning's or this afternoon's or this evening's discussions. So we're about to launch into the first phase of our roundtable. And the theme of the first phase for the next 30 minutes is understanding the priorities of various stakeholder groups and the implications of these understandings for feasibility of various policy options. You mentioned, Hartmut, stakeholders, and of course they're the key and the core to progress in any policymaking process. Over breakfast recently, I jotted down my understanding of the range of stakeholders, and I thought I would share that with panelists and with you. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. It's early morning thinking on my part, but and I'm sure the panelists will add stakeholder groups that I've missed. But here's just a suggestive list of major stakeholders around the context of DSI, potentially. We've got biodiversity researchers, the INSDC, other database managers, biorepositories, indigenous peoples, industry, private and public sectors, funding agencies, publishers, and governments. In the case of governments, today we won't be explicitly discussing their views or positions. Those are their views and positions, and we will hear amply about those as discussions unfold and negotiations conclude or draw to conclusion. But nevertheless, the panelists, of course, could very well reference their understanding of where governments as stakeholders might be on DSI and the criteria. It's also important to note, I was reminded recently that these stakeholder groups or sectoral groups often have communities of practice within them. And of course, these communities of practice may have divergent or different interests and views as it relates to DSI. So again, it's a fairly complex and wide-ranging set of stakeholders and of course interests. Before we move to the panelists, let me remind you what the co-chairs have reminded all of us quite recently, the co-chairs of the OEWG. They've urged us to focus on things practical, all right? And I think that's a very important reminder for all of us today and subsequently when it comes to DSI and some of these more complex issues. Ultimately, we need to be as practical as possible. This is not leading anyone in any direction. I'm quite agnostic when it comes to DSI, but I do think that is helpful to keep our feet on the ground when we can. And that's not to suggest that we should lack ambition. I'm not suggesting that at all, but it's actually possible to affect a change in policy and being practical at the same time. So we're going to launch into the panel phase 1, and I'm going to turn to Alejandro. Alejandro, you're representing your own expertise like all the fellow panelists, and you've got some very wide-ranging experience at the national, regional, and global levels. I'll let you choose which stakeholders' priorities to outline to start things off, and I'll ask the others to focus their remarks on a different set of stakeholders and their understanding of those priorities for those stakeholders. We're going to try and avoid repetition. I'll take a note if I think you've missed out a major stakeholder group. And I'm going to give each of the panelists 3 to 4 minutes for this first tranche. We'll try and go around twice in this phase 1 session. And again, the order will be Alejandro, followed by Paul, Margot, Henri, and Siva. So Alex, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ting, and thank you so much to the ABS Initiative for the organization of this event and for their kind invitation to me to participate as panelists. Also, thank you to Hartmut and to you as well, Ting, for setting the context and the key points to be discussed. Unfortunately, I have to start with a very sad note, as I would like to pay tribute to our colleague, Marle Aguilar, the ABS National Focal Point and National Coordinator of the Global ABS Project in Honduras, who tragically passed away last Sunday due to COVID. Mm-hmm. We will inform colleagues about the possible gathering to pay due tribute to her and her work. And I would like also to start, or I should start actually, with a kind of disclaimer in the sense that probably, like you also introduced yourself, Ting, I'm not an expert on DSI. in particular in comparison with the rest of the colleagues in the panel, no? As I have been formally disconnected from this process and this negotiation in the last 4 years, as I've been managing the implementation of the UNDP-GEF Global ABS project, trying to promote the full implementation of the Nagoya Protocol in 23 countries around the world. In that sense, we have been trying to work with all the right holders and stakeholders to better understand, address, and regulate at the national level ABS and the different issues connected, no, or embedded into ABS, including, of course, digital sequence information. In that sense, based on this internal exchange, some of the countries have clearly assumed that DSI comes from the utilization of a genetic resource, and consequently, they have covered DSI under their national legislation. So even before all these options were developed, some countries or some of the countries that we have been supporting have moved into option 1, no, clearly. Other countries are still under internal discussion, no, on how to address it. And in those technical discussions, I have not found anyone arguing that DSI does not come from the utilization of genetic resources, no? Therefore, in that sense, the key challenge is how to address this specific issue, no? Of course, the key initial and superficial, I would say, tension I have seen is that researchers are very much worried about open access, no, to this detailed sequence information, to the databases, and to information, as that is a key characteristic that makes the system for them extremely productive and successful, no? And the tension comes from governments that are worried about benefit sharing, no? The all discussion on how benefit sharing is really dissipating from their hands, no? They are not able to grab that benefit sharing. As United Nations, our current mantra, as you know, is not to leave anyone behind. And probably the current discussions have already left, in my view, indigenous peoples, no, and local communities behind as part of how science is being constructed at all levels, no? So probably I will stop here, my initial understanding, but I would like to also keep some points, no, for the second round, and I'm sure my colleagues, that I'm going to learn a lot from them because they are true experts, not like me. I hope they can also enlighten some of the points, and I can go into more detail in the second round, if that's okay for your team.
Thanks very much, Alex. Appreciate it very much. Paul?
Thanks very much, Tim. I think what I might do is just focus on two of the stakeholder perspectives. So I'm going to take inspiration from Alejandro and start with indigenous peoples and local communities. And I should explain that in the early part of my career, and indeed for about 15 years, I spent my time living and working with indigenous peoples in the Amazon in Venezuela. So it's a subject that is very dear to my heart. And I think, you know, of course, the central message from indigenous peoples themselves throughout international debates is that indigenous peoples will speak for themselves. So I'm not going to speak for them. Rather, what I'm going to do is kind of provide some reflections on issues that might be worth considering, including by indigenous people. So I think, you know, at first sight, as Alejandro is alluding to, we might think that indigenous peoples are in some kind of way remote from the debate about digital sequence information. But I think we need to bear in mind that indigenous peoples are affected by and have a stake in decision-making about DSI for a range of different reasons. So, you know, we can think about field workers who go to the lands, territories and waters of indigenous peoples. They collect samples which are later subjected to sequencing. Now, of course, as we understand, those collections would normally require the prior informed consent of Indigenous peoples, some kind of benefit sharing agreement, ethical conduct in research. We can also suspect there's a tendency to think that traditional knowledge is in some way remote from digital sequence information, but one can readily imagine, for example, that if we were interested in identifying varieties of plants for agriculture, we might actually look at traditional local rice varieties, for example, collect those with a view to sequencing them to identify the particular properties of those plants. So I think we have circumstances where traditional knowledge is relevant. I think some Indigenous colleagues might be tempted to point out that these are often anthropogenic environments. So we might think, such as Amazonia is in many respects an anthropogenic environment that has been affected by many thousands of years of human interaction. So I think there might be a temptation to argue that, well, in a way, there is an underlying interest from Indigenous peoples there. I think the challenge then becomes, well, we've seen great progress under the Nagoya Protocol in recognizing, and the Convention in recognizing the importance of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and so on. We can call for full and effective participation, prior informed consent and so on, but how in practical operational terms might the rights and interests of Indigenous peoples in this debate be recognized? And I was recently at a WIPO technical workshop on genetic sequence information, where one of the Indigenous delegates participating in that pointed to a project called localcontext.org, where, inspired by the Creative Commons, they have developed a labeling system for digital objects involving traditional knowledge and biocultural labels. Now, that has now been extended to something called the Genomic Observatory's metadatabase, GEOME. Yeah, so what we have here is an initiative coming from Indigenous peoples who are data experts, who are saying, well, actually, we can start to include Indigenous people's own digital labels in digital objects that make them findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, fair for Indigenous peoples themselves. And it seems to me that that could be a promising avenue for further debate. And kind of finally, in connection with Indigenous peoples, I think the question and perhaps the priority should be to think about Indigenous peoples' participation in the construction of benefit sharing, and for DSI, and as beneficiaries of benefit sharing. I think, as many Indigenous colleagues would point out, they are absolutely on the front lines of the defense of biodiversity around the planet. And regrettably, quite a number of them are subject to extrajudicial killings, their livelihoods are affected by biodiversity loss and so on. So I think that while there has been a tendency to regard DSI as a kind of separate subject from Indigenous peoples, I think we need to bring this back and ask ourselves the question, if there is going to be benefit sharing for this, shouldn't it be benefiting those people who are absolutely on the front lines of actual defense of biodiversity? So those are my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Let's move to Margot, please.
Thank you. And thanks so much again to Tim and to the ABS initiative for putting this together. So I'd like to comment a bit about priorities and concerns of another group of stakeholders, and that's biodiversity researchers, whose interests sometimes may overlap with industry, other times not. So some of the things that this group of stakeholders is concerned about is access restrictions on DSI, as well as tangible genetic resources from which DSI is obtained, and how that might affect their ability to do research, especially in a timely manner. There's also concern about the possibility, and in fact, the existence right now of a web of differing national laws and approaches with which they have to comply. dealing with DSI and benefit sharing. Concerns about the expansion of what is perceived as an already difficult bilateral benefit sharing system to DSI, an even more complex type of subject matter. And many researchers have had negative experiences with the bilateral negotiations for a variety of reasons, and therefore are not eager to see that system expanded to include DSI. There are a lot of frustrations and concerns associated with that. Also, you can have distinctions among researchers, academic researchers versus industry or commercial researchers who are concerned that with some of the proposals, while they may be facially neutral, they could have a disparate financial impact on them, or at least in their ability to pay for tying fees to access to DSI or databases or to sequencing equipment. These are concerns that can also be shared by researchers in developing countries, for example, versus higher income countries. And don't want to have the financial obligations of companies and researchers that are going to actually be making money off of products. And there are, in talking to folks, just various views about the need for monetary benefit sharing, because DSI and open access to DSI is seen as a benefit, a non-monetary benefit. Also concerns about the infrastructure of the database system, the DSI database systems, and the fact that there's a lot of money that is going into that currently, and how that would or should be factored into any sort of additional approach to DSI benefit sharing. And some focus on the fact that perhaps you're starting with DSI or using it somewhere in the process, but a lot of additional research and investment goes into developing a commercial product, and DSI is often far removed from that final product. Its contribution may be difficult to measure. And so again, questions about value and certainly value of a particular sequence, and the way some of the approaches that might involve tracking and tracing may not seem realistic or taking that value component into consideration. I've also talked to some researchers who see their use of DSI as similar to reading a scientific journal article for which they wouldn't expect to share benefits with the author. But others see it as similar to requesting a material foot sample for which they would expect to pay. So there are a variety of different views. There's not a one monolithic view, but lots of concerns and perspectives among researchers. And I think I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Margot. Henri.
Thank you, Tim. Greetings, everyone. To start, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation and for the opportunity to be part of such an important discussion. I would like to address an overlooked stakeholder, which is the environment itself. And I would like to start by saying that all stakeholders may share a common priority, which is to adopt the policy option that can better and sooner achieve the deliverables listed as points for consideration by the first Global DSI Dialogue report, particularly those addressed by Hartmut: the potential to generate and deliver global benefits, the potential to enhance the ability to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, while contributing to fight biodiversity loss, an option in which all stakeholders, including perhaps the most important one, the environment, benefit from. The DSI deadlock is not desirable for anyone. It is short-sighted to try to anticipate the capture of benefits from DSI by trying to control its use, since benefits will only materialize if access to DSI is open and facilitated. Moreover, it is important to realize that the control of use is most likely impossible to be properly addressed in a bilateral way, as it will be costly to all stakeholders due to DSI's very nature. At the same time, some may be trying to avoid recognizing obligations in relation to DSI in order to escape transaction costs and control. not realizing that this option won't impede national legislations to address DSI in a bilateral way, generating a scenario of increased transaction and compliance costs for DSI users, providers, and data banks alike. I believe a practical solution should be one in which the idea of control of use and that of evading it are less important for all ABS stakeholders than the idea of meeting the required conditions for the mobilization of resources to promote conservation. Monetary resources from products commercialization, yes, but also technological resources and the ultimately needed generation and exchange of relevant scientific information on biodiversity, scientific resources, such as DSI. Finally, we need to ask ourselves to what extent are we willing to relinquish a certain level of sovereignty over the control of DSI use to gain access to the beneficial outcomes of open DSI use. Also, to what extent are we willing to recognize the need of sharing monetary benefits from the commercialization of products based on DSI so as to keep DSI public available and open to use. We need to be ready to balance the opportunity cost embedded in the discussion, bear in mind what the real objective of an ABS policy is, which is to mobilize scientific, technological, and financial resources for biodiversity conservation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henri. Ziva, please. Sorry to keep you waiting.
No, that's perfect, actually, because I'm going to use my privilege at being the last panelist and your invitation, Tim, to be a bit creative, to think across the board to all stakeholders. So what I want to do is just present a few processes that are at play, I feel, across the board and that are important to listen and understand. So I see the stakeholder positions not as positions, but more as positioning. So this is a dynamic process. And I think where we end up is going to be a function of persuasion. As a function of persuasion, I think these processes, which allow us to actually listen to what's going on, I feel is important. So with that in mind, I have three I want to talk about. One is the use of proxies. So when stakeholders talk about certain terms or certain concerns, what are they actually talking about? And I'd like to look at sovereignty and loss of national patrimony when it comes to DSI as an underlying concern over control. So if you want to move the conversation away from sovereignty, I suggest we should then look at how we might be able to hand control back, maybe via tagging in databases or through IP systems. Another important proxy I feel that crops up quite often is this idea of science as a public good. And to that, I would like to add, what Henri just mentioned about conservation goals, open access goals. I feel that most often it's a proxy for doing or continuing to do science as it is currently done. So it's a very status quoist approach. So you're asking people to swim in the deep end when most of there's one hand tied behind their back. So when I hear science as a public good, I want to ask, how do we free that one hand that's tied behind your back? The second process is about differential weighting. I think when we tend to talk about these things, different stakeholders weight concerns differently based on certain invisible or internal criteria that may not be self-evident. So one of the criteria that's really talked up is the burden to scientists, the administrative burden to science. And consequently, I feel what is talked down is the capacity building and this huge gap in technology that we have. So what happens when you weight something differently is you tend to be very specific about the things that you weight heavily, and you tend to be quite ambiguous and fussy about the things that you downplay. So in this context, I think having very specific goals on capacity building, how much data needs to be downloaded in different parts of the world in order to talk about some sort of parity in how the data is being used, talk in terms of those kinds of specificities to address this problem of differential weighting. There is another one under differential weighting, but I'll do that very briefly. There may be a chance to come back to it, which is the weighting that's given to users, the status of users rather than users, which I think is something we might need to grapple with here. My third process that I want to flag up is the difference between modalities and principles. I think when we talk about modalities, as we are doing here with policy options, there is a tendency to forget that these are modalities that work in the service of legal principles. If we do not talk about those legal principles, then we shouldn't be surprised if there is a misunderstanding about which legal principle in what form is served by which modality. So talking about monetary, non-monetary, voluntary, non-voluntary benefit sharing, for instance, is about equitable outcomes. We may agree on the modalities, but we may disagree about whether this equitable outcomes were in fact met. So being upfront about that, I think, is quite important. I do have a couple more under modalities versus principles. I'll maybe mention one, which is from my background working on BBNJ, this sort of comparison between the bilateral architecture and the multilateral architecture, I think, is going to be quite important. Given the direction of travel in BBNJ, there is also a tendency there to talk about modalities without talking about the underlying principles. And I think that's much more acute in BBNJ because we're having all these conversations without establishing the status of the underlying MGRs. So I see a parallel there. And of course, with the CBD, the question of Article 3 and Article 4B, and whether anything we decide with the DSI is going to supplant the bilateral architecture is a heuristic that we should bear in mind when we talk about modalities. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Seema. Thank you, all of you. There's so many directions we could go in. And just simply to volunteer an observation that, you know, over my many years involved in a range of forums, some things have not actually, they progress, but they're still around. Some of these issues are fundamental. And just picking up on your last point, Siva, it's interesting that not only in so far on DSI and the discussions that I've witnessed and the materials that I've read, in the CBD more broadly, but also in the other fora related to DSI and to benefit sharing, to genetic resources and TK, very rarely during negotiations, and even now, is the word equitable used, other than in a current discussion. I'm not talking about an objective. I'm actually talking in a back to and fro in a discussion. And I think that's actually, among many other interesting points, that's a very relevant one to today's discussion. Alex, I might go back to you for 1 minute. We're out of time, but I think it's worth doing a really, really quick round for those who have something urgent to share. Alex, do you no? Anyone?
I would like to add on just a bit to what Henri and Alejandro was saying about the IPLCs and their perspectives and the way that they tend to be excluded from the DSI discussions or marginalized in these discussions. And I think it's really important, Tim, to go back to your initial framing about our survival. IPLCs safeguard 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. And it's not just their passive being in a place. They use their knowledge to interact with and modify the natural environment in ways that enhance and preserve biodiversity. We don't have DSI if we don't have Indigenous peoples and local communities actively preserving it for us. And there's so much biodiversity that has not yet been analyzed. So I think it's really, and even though DSI may be separate from TK, it would be erroneous to assume that the knowledge and efforts of IPLCs didn't contribute to the ultimate availability of that DSI. I think that's really important. It sometimes gets overlooked as we're thinking about just this informational aspect of the DSI.
Thank you, Margot. I'm going to close this round. Anyone else?
Yes, very quickly, if you allow me, Tim.
Yeah, go ahead.
And apologies because I was quiet when you mentioned my name in your previous intervention. No, thank you so much. In particular to Paul, fantastic and very promising initiative. No, and you have to share that details, please, Paul, after the meeting. No, on the initiative that you mentioned on the indigenous peoples who are experts on data and how they are pushing that initiative. As we are closing the understanding, I think it's important, or my understanding is that I think we are in a much better position than when we were negotiating the Nagoya Protocol, for instance, as now the scientific and research community are paying attention to this issue. My experience as EU negotiator at that time, when we were negotiating the Nagoya Protocol, was quite funny because I think we were quite successful adopting the Nagoya Protocol in time in a not very easy international framework at that moment with climate change and very convoluted international community that has been worsening actually since then. But importantly, it was funny because as the EU, we were sharing a lot of documents with the stakeholders and receiving limited feedback. And it was funny because as soon as we were negotiating the EU regulation, 2 or 3 years after the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol, we started to receive comments from different sectors. And the comments were, well, this is not applicable to us. And researchers are still, some of the researchers are still in that phase. No? And we can see actually the Q&A section with some comments saying, well, this should be outside, pathogens, this should be outside. So unfortunately, we are still going through the cycle of acceptance, that goes with this kind of psychological things, that first we have denial, then we have maybe anger or depression, bargaining, and acceptance. I think some colleagues at the research institutions are doing a fantastic job. They have moved really into acceptance, into we need to make it work. But I don't think all the research community is there. And the important thing, there are limitations for sure. But unless we are all on board trying to make it work, this is not going to happen. And this is, I think, an opportunity as we are moving to the second phase of this dialogue, this debate, is an opportunity to address other issues that are not working on ABS. And just to close this comment, at the beginning of the pandemic last year, we read some articles actually from the pharma industry insisting on the importance of leaving outside the Nagoya Protocol pathogens, right? And showing how quickly all the exchanges have been done in the case of COVID, which I think is fantastic, it's incredible. It's great for humanity, right? In very short period of time, we have developed a vaccine and we are fighting quite successfully in very short time against this pandemic. However, if we see the results, it's still a missed opportunity because we are repeating every day. All our leaders are saying we need to go all move and cure, right? Otherwise, we will not be able to recover, or we do it all together, or we will not be able to override this situation. But we see the situation with the vaccines, what is happening. And this is about ABS. This is you were mentioned, Ting. Is this equitable? It's not. So we have a great power regarding research and research capacities and capabilities, but this is not equitable. So we have an opportunity here, and we have, as a big difference with, in comparison with the Nagoya Protocol, I think the stakeholders are much more involved, which can provide a real solution that is workable for all. Apologies, Tim. Sorry, I took too long.
Thank you. No, it was again some very very worthwhile comments. I must say, if I may, I think that is an important contrast between, for example, Nagoya Protocol discussions and this one. I'm very heartened to see the amount of engagement by stakeholders. industry and public as well. I think that's very encouraging. It's better to, in my experience in policymaking, it's better to have people in the tent than outside it. It's better to involve them in the discussion because, as you know, from the global comes national, and from national goes subnational. The people that implement, the people that implement international obligations are not necessarily the governments, they're actually the stakeholders. They in turn receive that obligation, many of you will know as lawyers and policymakers. But that's an important point when it comes to policy formulation. Get the people in, get them involved, and we see that. It may make it difficult at the front end, but I actually think it bodes well for DSI in the long run. I'm sorry, but I'm going to move to phase 2. So in phase 2, again, we got about less than 30 minutes. I'm going to ask each panelist to suggest practical ways in which the concerns and priorities of various stakeholder groups can be addressed, or in some cases, how they can be ignored or subjected to other more important considerations and priorities, because life is a series of trade-offs, as you know. But again, importantly, without producing conflict, deadlock, or stagnation. So again, it's unlocking rather than locking the issues. Of course, you may feel free to reference some of the policy options and various priorities of stakeholders. You must necessarily do that, of course. I'm going to start this session off with Margot, who will be followed by Henri, Siva, Paul, and Alejandro. And Margot, building on what we've heard so far in the on this panel, perhaps you could say a few words from the IP side of things and the stakeholder concerns and needs from that world in the context to formulating criteria for the policy option exercise. So I'll go to you for about 3 to 4 minutes, Margot, and then we'll pass it on to Henri and others.
Sure. So IP holders or patent holders, if we'll focus more specifically as a group of stakeholders, have a variety of concerns. If focusing specifically on patents, there's a concern about IP offices as Nagoya Protocol checkpoints and the possibility that benefit sharing obligations for tangible materials or DSI can lead to delays in obtaining patent protection. Legal certainty concerns over whether their patent rights could be impacted or revoked if they violated domestic law relating to DSI benefit sharing, and perhaps inadvertently fail to account for a partial sequence, because when we're talking about DSI, we could be talking about portions of sequences from many different organisms. So it's much more complicated from a patent applicant standpoint, or at least potentially could be. And the transaction costs if DSI, again, is subject to a bilateral regime. So in thinking of principles that would be important, simplicity, ease of compliance, something that's easy for folks to comply with, a system that involves or provides legal certainty regarding obligations and meeting those obligations. Certainly for our patent holders, they would prefer for DSI issues to be addressed outside of the patent system and not tied to the obtaining of a patent right. And having a clear trigger for benefit sharing obligations. Is it going to be the commercialization, putting a product on the market, but figuring out whatever the trigger is going to be would also be helpful. So focusing on that particular group. I mean, I have others I can talk about, but I'll stop there. I know we're limited on time.
Thanks. Henri, over to you.
Thanks again. My first comment is that a purely bilateral approach for DSI use won't meet any particular stakeholder expectations, nor will a system that can't link benefit sharing to countries of origin. For me, the ideal option would be the one combining options 2.2, multilateral, no peak for DSI use, and with the standard mutually agreed terms at international level, with elements of the option 2.1, benefit sharing triggered at commercialization of products based on DSI and channeled back to the countries of origin when possible. In my opinion, open access under terms and conditions is a practical solution. adopting a multilateral bounded openness option could keep DSI download, use, and exchange open under terms and conditions that would guarantee benefit sharing to conservation. Instead of the monitoring of ideas or expectations from DSI use, a multilateral bounded openness option would allow the monitoring of use to be focused on the outcomes of DSI use, such as scientific research publications, papers, intellectual property right claims, patents, cultivars, and marketable products. Users with such outcomes would be required to register in a multilateral registration system to be governed by the parties and implemented by the Secretariat through the ABS clearinghouse, for instance. And in such results declaration, users would disclose information on the DSI use, the database, and the country of origin when available. In this sense, the ABS community may consider adopting a policy that focuses on DSI use outcomes regularization through a multilaterally governed system, a one-stop shop system for registration of all results of DSI use, including those with country tags. Transparency would be enhanced by national focal points being able to collectively monitor those DSI registries through the system. Monetary benefit sharing obligations should be shared by the user through a global benefit sharing mechanism, also governed by the parties. And if the DSI origin is identifiable, the global mechanism would in turn channel those resources to the provider countries. When the DSI has no country tag, is cosmopolitan, or is distributed across jurisdiction and taxa, the global mechanism would collect the benefits and apply them to funding global, regional, or sub-regional conservation initiatives, or as suggested by Vogel and Miller, to finance the requisite infrastructure to make the whole thing work. Finally, not taking into consideration the legal aspects, I would say that this multilateral system could host DSI use registries from biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, for food and agriculture, from Antarctica, and also from space microorganisms brought by celestial bodies. And in conclusion, my option would be a one-stop shop multilateral electronic system to register the outcomes of DSI use, regardless of jurisdiction or sector of use, with a global mechanism that is capable of directing benefits to conservation, including benefits to countries of origin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henri. Siva?
I've stuck to the policy options, and I do have an ideal numbering on the menu that I'd like to see. But before I present those sort of numbers from the options given to us, I want to emphasize again about 4 points here. I think it's important to avoid regime complexity. Regime complexity is when you have overlapping treaties with no hierarchies. So, people are subject to conflicting obligations and burdens. Coherence, coherence starting from understanding proxies, understanding differential weightings, modalities, how they link to principles, and compliance. I think enforcement and compliance, without enforcement and compliance, the whole setup is leaky, and it could be reciprocal obligations. It's sort of a system of reciprocal compliance. But I think in order to be coherent, and as a lawyer, I would like to see the package start somewhere and finish somewhere. Third, it goes back to Alejandro's very important point. We have to decide whether we are merely consolidating behavior or we are changing behavior. My understanding of setting new legal norms is that they will lead to behavior change. So accepting that will make the process go easier, I think, for all of us. My fourth point, I think, is a really important point, and it's often sort of missed in these highly technical conversations, and it's to do with agenda setting. So Tim, I heard you say about the desirability of having stakeholders participate right from the get-go. But if we have a preponderance of stakeholders from certain jurisdictions, then the danger that the agenda is set by those stakeholders, I think, is quite high. Because if there is a lack of stakeholders, database owners, patent holders, even in some jurisdictions, then those voices simply aren't being heard. And also, keeping in mind BB&J, my ideal option with some discussion and modification would be a version of 2.2 with 4 embedded in 2.2 and elements of 3.2 where there's a multilateral system and not just voluntary contributions, but obligatory contributions. But I would emphasize that 4 has to be a part of 2.2 for this to make sense. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Siva. Paul?
Yes, thanks very much, Tim. And I'm going to pick up on, I think, option 2.2. I mean, I think as Tim probably recalls, quite a number of years ago, I suggested that one possible approach to access and benefit sharing was this idea of having access and benefit ABS Commons licenses modeled on the Creative Commons and open source licenses from software. And what kind of interested me about those is that licenses improve transparency about the terms and conditions on which things are used. The people doing the providing can find them. And you can get some kind of greater visibility to what is happening with the works that you provide. Now, I mean, okay, that argument 10 years ago didn't succeed in the Nagoya Protocol. However, in the meantime, there are now billions of digital objects out there that have these licenses attached to them. In the case of the Global Biodiversity Information Facility in 2016, they adopted Creative Commons licenses for their taxonomic records. There are now 1.4 billion taxonomic records that have these licenses, and that includes several millions of genetic sequence data related items from the EBI, European Nucleotide Archive, and also from the Barcode of Life. So this is already happening. The sky has not fallen, and it's clearly meeting a need. So my suggestion would be to negotiate a set of standard interoperable licenses modeled on these existing experiences and adapted, of course, to the particular circumstances, and that would improve transparency and clarity on the terms of use for everybody, including industry. But I wanted to come back, I think, to what Henry was talking about in closing on this. Is I think we do need to see tangible, quantifiable benefits returning to biodiversity from this, or I think it's probably just a giant waste of time. And I think that we need to think carefully about the income generating options. And the reason I say this is because a number of years ago now, I was one of the team engaged in the evaluation of the effectiveness of the benefit sharing mechanism under the plant treaty. And I recall sitting in a room in Rome, being horrified when the economists came back and said, this benefit sharing mechanism is never going to return the benefits that are expected. Yeah. And the lesson I think we learned from that is we have a range of options kind of on the table, which is membership fees, subscription fees. I've been promoting these cloud-based models, these infrastructure charges. There's micro levy, there's biodiversity bonds, there's benefit sharing on commercialization. What we need to see in credible terms is actually some modeling of what the costs of these options are relative to the benefits in order to have more effective evidence base for assessing their feasibility. Or the danger is there will be enthusiasm for X option or Y option, and we will end up in a similar treaty position to down the line to the one we arrived at with the plant treaty. The plant treaty, of course, experience is, of course, really important, but I think it's vitally important for parties to actually have some evidence base and modeling to inform decision making about the benefit sharing options. And finally, I think it's a mistake also to simply have one benefit sharing option. I think it would be better to look for a range of benefit sharing options that could bring in perhaps differing levels of income and differing sets of circumstances, but we then avoid all eggs in one basket kind of approach to benefit sharing. If that doesn't pan out, then you have nothing. If you have a range of different options, then you're more likely to generate substantive benefit sharing for biodiversity. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. Alejandro?
Thank you. And just to echo and connect with the final points made by Paul, but also by all the previous colleagues, no, it's clear we need something practical, no? We need something simple, and ABS has become a very complex tool, right? And it's not only about law, it's about innovation and technology, no? And I think the last intervention from Paul connect directly to exactly that, no? So the challenge, I think, is clear to have some standardization. The great points that allowed to approve Nagoya on time in 2010, it was the flexibility. But that flexibility has been a problem at the moment because it doesn't have any concrete checkpoints. So we have to cover the limitations of the Nagoya Protocol with great principle, great approach through the contract agreements, right? So I think there are tools there, and we are trying to test different tools, innovation tools, then can support how to follow the contract. And we need to standardize those tools. In personal terms, I'm not sure whether that necessarily leads to a global mechanism, because probably using certain standard contracts with certain IT tools, we could solve those challenges, right? But definitely, I think we all agree on certain level of standardization. Otherwise, this is not going to work, no? And standardization is going to lower transaction costs, it's going to ease access and all the process, no? But yeah, doubts about whether the global is the solution, because in my view, that may actually place the benefit sharing far from the real stakeholders, real providers, from indigenous peoples, and add bureaucracy when there are other IT tools that can produce the same effects, no? So those are my thoughts on this.
Thanks, Alejandro. Thank you, everyone. Again, so many directions to go in. But in the event that I forget during the wrap-up session, but one of the advantages, if there are any positives out of the current pandemic, has been in terms of the international processes. So we have, in effect, clearly, we've not got any definitive negotiations, truly substantive negotiations, really going on at the moment, right? And that's led to more time with the technology, more discussion, and I hope more analysis, because a good number of, if not all the panelists today so far have given us some suggestions about where there are gaps, either in understanding of behavior and of interest, but also in terms of the options. So the parties, the stakeholders, actually, we have the luxury of time during the pandemic to really take our time and to improve understanding. Of course, this webinar is all about improving understanding, but it's a terrific opportunity, probably, I hope in my lifetime, unprecedented, to be able to really understand what the behaviors are and what the solutions are. And again, you've already noted some really concrete ideas that maybe we can pursue and others could pursue after this webinar is long over. We've got a few minutes. Does anyone have anything pressing to share? Yes, please, Henri.
Thank you. Building from the points made by Siva regarding changing mindset, in my optimistic point of view, practical solutions will arise if the focus of regulation is on results, outcomes of DSI use, instead of processes like downloading, assessing, exchanging. The processes used to extract the potential value of the genetic resources in the form of information will always be in constant evolution and change. One needs only to look at the rapid advances of quantum computing to know that sooner or later, the D in DSI may be replaced by a Q, and the digital will be quantum sequence information. But if there is something that always lasts, regardless of the advancement of technologies, is the way in which biological information is translated into results, indicators, such as papers, patents, and products ready to the market. If we, the ABS community, continue to regulate processes based on techniques, we will always be chasing technological advances and filling gaps in outdated systems. If we regulate the products, in spite of how science advances, they will invariably be translated into papers, patents, and products, which can be quantified, monitored by checkpoints, and integrated with Nagoya Protocol traceability system. I hence hold the opinion that we, the ABS community, we should really evaluate this paradigm shift. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Right. Before we move to the next panel, let's just reflect on where we've been and where we're going. This current phase of the panel has been dealing with integrating stakeholders' views in the DSI process. So in order to get a snapshot on the global status of the DSI process, we would like to ask all of you watching this webinar to fill in a short poll on your own participation in the science policy-based process of DSI. So I think yes, indeed, the poll is open in front of you. So if you take a moment, please do share information with us about following. It shouldn't take you long. Then we'll move. In fact, let's move forward now with the final substantive phase 3 of this webinar. This is simple to say and perhaps a bit more challenging to actually to do. But this round is about the panelists actually and openly and honestly, I hope, describing what they've learned from other panelists and how their understandings on the issues have either changed, evolved, or degenerated, I guess, as well. Whether it's on the perspectives of stakeholders or on the way forward and the criteria. This is an open session, but building on what you've already discussed so far. And I'd also like to hear from you about, from your perspectives, what's missed. What have we missed in the context of the theme of this webinar? Is there some key views that have been missed out in the discussion, some key stakeholders, interests, perspectives, or some keys to unlocking the debate? Have we missed something? Have we got it wrong? Or have your fellow panelists got it wrong? Or are they onto something that looks promising? So let's begin with you, Paul. This simple task.
Okay, thank you, Tim. I was just scribbling furiously to reflecting on Henry's comments. I think I wanted to go back to one of Henry's comments about control. And Henry's talked about the importance of the economics of information, the work that Joe Vogel and Manuel Ruiz have done on the economics of information, and I think that deserves greater consideration than it presently receives. That points us to issues of non-excludability, non-rivalrous, and so on. However, going back to Henry's point, my reflection on this is a little bit different, is that in thinking about the economics of this, we should think about the nature of digital sequence information as an asset. What kind of asset is it, and how is that the value of that asset realized? And fundamentally, I think if we think about genomes, a sequenced genome as a particular form of asset, and start to kind of turn it over in our hands, as it were, and think about where the values of that lie, the value of an individual genome is essentially zero unless you compare it with other genomes. Fundamentally, genomics is an exercise in comparing and contrasting the properties of the same or similar organisms to find useful properties, insights, and observations about biological processes. Now, the implication of that is that the economic or indeed any other value of DSI as a form of asset can only be realized by sharing it. And this is why I think Henry's point is important. If parties insist on pursuing a route that focuses on tightly grasping and maintaining control over this type of asset, they will never realize the value of that asset because it can't be realized in that way. It's intrinsic to the nature of the asset, that its economic or other value can only be realized when it's compared and contrasted with other assets of the same type. That implies, however, that you need some kind of catcher system. If we think about it, actually comes from Chinese philosophy, where you try and grasp sand in your hand. Of course, it escapes through your hand and you're left with nothing. You need to construct some kind of cup, some kind of vessel that will allow you to capture and carry that vessel. And I think, reflecting on Henry's comment, that that's what we need here. And I also have a final observation which relates to Henry's argument about capturing at the point of commercialization. I do, in fact, agree with Henry on the point about capturing at commercialization, but I think if we're thinking about the broader benefits to how do we generate income for biodiversity, a return to biodiversity, that in and of itself is not enough. What we actually need is a wider range of measures that include kind of more bread and butter style income generating opportunities for a return to biodiversity, which is why, for example, in my argument has been, well, all of these companies, universities, and so on are moving to using cloud-based computing services to analyze data at the scale of petabytes, exabytes, quantum, what have yous. We need some kind of system that recognizes that extracts a degree of return for biodiversity to go back in to reinvest in biodiversity, and responds to technological change. It just grows with those technological changes. So those would be my observations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. Sorry, I'm preoccupied with, like all of you, taking notes. Thanks very much. Siva, please.
Okay, so I have 2 points that I draw from my panelists' contributions. And one, it's not that we've missed it, but perhaps we've sort of glossed over it to some extent. So just drawing on what Margot said about transaction costs and any ensuing uncertainty in a patent that might be granted or not granted. I just wanted to say here that in my conversations with scientists and some quantitative work that we did with scientists, most scientists are surprised not to be asked by the patent system to declare origin. I mean, it may depend on it may be a particular group of scientists that we spoke to or who are willing to speak to us, but I don't think we should underestimate how much they can be partners in the compliance ecosystem. The second point, I really like Paul's idea of not putting all your eggs in one basket and about spreading the benefit sharing story across different kinds of modalities. And I think given our experience of the Nagoya Protocol, that to my mind makes a lot of sense. The third point, which is the sort of slightly glossed over point here, is we haven't really spoken about what degree of control state parties can and want to exercise over the private sector. When it comes, we can talk about capacity building and scientific cooperation till the cows come home, but unless you are obligating these companies to engage in that behavior, and what are the measures by which you would obligate them to do that, then I think we're not left with very much. I point to Article 66.2 of the TRIPS agreement, which is very poorly implementation is non-existent, which obliges state parties to ensure that private enterprises in their jurisdictions are engaging in capacity building and technology transfer. Also, the COVID story for me, yes, it's a success of science, but it's also an abject failure of our moral imagination, because the way the vaccines are distributed is potentially a catastrophic failure. So again, that to me is about even in conditions of extremists, it's a public health crisis like we've never seen before. We are unable to or unwilling to exercise control over the private sector and the property rights that they own. So that's a lesson to all of us talking about DSI, particularly when we talk about things like triggering across the value chain. It is really about controlling private enterprise, and how are we going to do that? So thank you.
Thanks very much, Siva. Ari?
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is a missing point, but during the panel, I kept asking myself, should we reflect if this is not an opportunity for changing the way we address ABS regulation? Should we keep applying the regulatory frameworks conceived to the scientific and technological idiosyncrasies of the 90s into scientific technological circumstances of the post-2020s and further? Should we continue to repeat interpretations that restrict the terms of the CBD without considering the advances in techniques? And moreover, the control, from my point of view, the control of use should be seen as a means and not an end in itself. Similarly, benefit sharing should also be seen as a means to guarantee that all will benefit from healthy and conserved biodiversity. To conclude, I believe that the ABS committee, we need a practical solution that is more aligned to the original idea of ABS, which is to be the tool to build transparency in mutual understanding to generate scientific, technological, and financial resources to promote biodiversity conservation for the benefits of all of us. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Henri. Leandro?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm not sure. I mean, I agree on most of the comments made and from colleagues that are much more expert on this, no? And unfortunately, I always go back to the kind of points that were also highlighted by Siva, no, in her last intervention. We continue to have the similar problems and limitations from the last years, which are, in the case of ABS, lack of integration, okay? Because ABS is not just about biodiversity conservation. It's actually mainly about research. How many ministries of research or departments in charge of research are participating in the negotiations? From my experience, the only case I know is the Ministry of Science, Environment, and something else from Cuba, but I have not seen that kind of approach or integration. No? So to integrate or mainstream ABS into the CBD and into other policies is still challenging. It's still not happening. No? And it goes beyond research. It covers also health, as we have seen, no, with examples that we just mentioned. And few times I have met during all these years in more than 30, 40 countries trying to implement ABS, met with the health department, not the ministry or high-level bureaucrat, but just with someone from the Department of Health, no? And of course, economy. So who are these guys? And the reflection at the end of the day is that the paradigm now should move into the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is not the big change. Is that this is not like previous goals for developing countries to achieve, but are for all the countries, and not just for countries or governments, but for civil society and for us, because as you started with, Ting, this is about our planet, no? And what is going to happen and what kind of place we want to live in, no? That takes a while, but we should have all these colleagues coming, no, to the table and searching for that kind of practical solution, no? Combining law, combining IT tools, because this is biotech, no, and highly technological, no. So to a certain extent, I'm more confused on what can be done, but I presume confusion and chaos is always part of the process, no. And again, I'm not an expert like my colleagues that have more clear views on the different options, no? And they have been much more directly involved on their development. Sorry.
Thank you, Alejandro. We're not going to end the panel on that note, I can assure you. And I've rarely seen you confused. I'm sure Margot can sort you out immediately. Margot?
I don't know about that, but I do have a few thoughts. And one is, as I was listening to Henri in particular, and I agree that we have learned a lot over the past 25 plus years that we could incorporate, but Tim, I still go back to your admonition that we be practical and pragmatic in things that might work. And so I think at this point, I would hate to see the perfect be the enemy of the good. And what I mean by that is I think in the near term, it is important to safeguard the bilateral approach for tangible genetic resources, to deal with DSI, see if we can come up with something that works for DSI, and then think about incorporating that more broadly, with thinking of natural information more broadly. Another somewhat controversial point that we didn't really talk about, but I think it's important to mention, is there's certainly an interest in ensuring flexibility in the use of funds received from benefit sharing and DSI, multilateral benefit sharing. I am thinking of it being multilateral. The Nagoya Protocol does not require parties to use monetary funds specifically for conservation, which some folks see as a vice, some as a virtue. But I think that it is important to keep flexible in terms of direct and indirect support of conservation, and not being too paternalistic in too narrowly limiting what it can be used for. I'm reminded of a story a national focal point in a developing country told me about a tribe that receives a monetary benefit from a European company from genetic resources that tribe shares. And in areas all around the tribe, the land is being deforested, converted to other uses, but the chief of that tribe will not allow any of that to happen where that tribe lives, because they are benefiting from the genetic resources. You know, they're getting money for food, for education, to improve the quality of life of the indigenous people, the local community members there. So putting too much of a constraint on how the money could be spent, I think could backfire in terms of our desire to benefit conservation. In the last tranche, you had people were talking about their preferred approaches. I don't really have that, except to say I do think that option 4, that non-monetary does need to be a part of any solution. I think a global, some sort of multilateral mechanism does need to be a part of any solution, and that if we're going to get to a consensus approach, it's going to need to have low transaction costs, clear trigger, legal certainty, differentiated obligations, and a governance regime that allows for fair and equitable structuring of monetary distributions to address this range of stakeholder concerns that we've discussed today. So the discussion has been really helpful to me, not necessarily getting to a particular solution, but thinking about the kinds of things that we need to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. We have just a few moments left on this phase of the panel. I'm going to open it up. Show your hands, and
if you allow me, Ting, just to follow up directly on Margot's last intervention, and thank you, Margot, because you put it some of the thoughts that were in my mind in a much nicer and in an order way, no, which is fantastic. No, I definitely agree with you. I think what could happen in a relatively short period of time is that we continue to work in the bilateral approach, but we have seen not only on DSI, but on different other sectors, specific sectors, that some countries need help. They don't know about how to negotiate these different sectors, right? So in many cases, it could be helpful for them to have options, to have certain standards or certain, I don't know how to call it, kind of a standard material transfer agreement that they can use directly if they don't have anything, right? So an option that they can implement directly following their national legislation, no? I think that can be extremely helpful, and that is missing, no, for some countries. They don't have the capacity, they don't have the connection to coordinate with those other sectors, no, health, research, economy that I was mentioning before, no. So a quite straightforward is, yes, DSI has to be regulated. We definitely want to do that, but we lack the capacity, the technical and scientific capacity to do it, you know. So can we have some examples or international standards that can be immediately be used at the national level? I think that could be extremely helpful.
Thanks very much, Alejandro. Paul.
Yes, thanks very much. In fact, I'm going to agree with both Margot and Alejandro on this. I think in reflecting on this, we have to consider the issue of scale. So we're dealing with all the parties around the world, plus Antarctica, plus BBNJ and so on. Then we're dealing with over 1,600 databases distributed in around the world and so on. Is whatever measures are introduced, I think inevitably need to be phased based on what's already happening at the moment, and then start to introduce new things. I think they also need to be simple in terms of they need to be practical, so they can be introduced into large scale systems. I think if I was to speak as a database manager, I would say this system has to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Anything that you seek to introduce to this must not interrupt the functioning of that system and its ability to deliver services to users. So I think we need to take that perspective. And that's, I also wanted to just briefly say something about this idea of the kind of global mechanism, and it seems to be constructed in people's imagination as kind of some giant fund somewhere. I think there's probably other ways of thinking about it. Some form of mechanism could be distributed nationally with national contributions. It could be held nationally. There might be a whole spectrum of different options for the construction of a mechanism, you know, that don't involve simply one income generating scheme, and don't involve a giant fund somewhere in the sky that costs a fortune to run. So I think there's probably some scope for creative thought about those options as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We have 2 minutes left. 1 minute left. Right. Ari.
We will start from the point made by Paul Oldham, and that's the time to be creative and ambitious, bearing in mind that we don't have much time since the rate of biodiversity loss. And having pointed out the need for ambition, I would like to quote Paul Oldham when he says that timidity does not help solve global issues. Bold thinking that moves outside the box and reconceptualizes the box can assist with identifying effective, workable solutions. Thank you.
Well put. Confirming that when you're around long enough, someone was going to quote back to you what you said.
That's the problem, Paul, of being a wise man, right?
Yeah, and a very nice way to finish off this phase of the discussions. Indeed, thank you all. So we're now with 10 minutes to go. We're going to actually do a short wrap-up session. I'll say a few words if I may. I've been trying to take notes while listening closely to the panelists, but I've got some impressions that I'd like to leave with you. Again, as I mentioned, I have no money in this discussion, but I have strong concerns that it goes in the right direction. So I'll say a few words, not a summary, by no means, just a few remarks from some notes that I've taken. impressionistic notes, actually. Then we'll turn to Suel, to the ABS Capacity Development Initiative, to say a few words about a poll and what will follow, actually. This is just one step in a multi-step process, as you know. But in contrast to some, I would say this is in part, yes, about the journey, but actually we do have somewhere to arrive at, I hope sooner rather than later. Let me start by simply saying, and it's entirely insufficient, thank you to all the panelists. This has actually been really interesting, and not just really interesting, but we've got some concrete ideas to follow up on. And I actually think I'm a bit clearer on the range of options and on the way to proceed in terms of understanding the criteria and applying them. I do think you've really risen to the challenge, and I'm really very, very grateful, as I know everyone is on the line here today. So thank you so much for your time, your expertise, your patience, and your generous support of the global process. I think we will be hearing from you again, and I certainly hope so. So, a few impressions from today's discussion. As I mentioned, this is just one step in a longer journey, but it has revealed a few things. I think we can leave with everyone. You know, I understood to hear that, you know, in the context of DSI, it's important for sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity, and it's about benefit sharing in a practical way. And I really like the phrase, benefit sharing is not just an objective, it's a means to an objective, meeting an objective. I think that's a very nice way of encapsulating two sides of the coin, but also suggesting that things are not mutually exclusive. And in the sense of mutually exclusive, I noted that a good number of you talked about whether it was intellectual silos or ministerial silos, the ghettoizing of the issues and of the solutions and the way we actually behave as human beings in either in a legal system or in a administrative and bureaucratic system. And those silos can actually lead to maintaining divisions in terms of our thinking, but also in terms of, well, actually of our behavior. And that's, of course, a problem for environment ministries, but it's also a problem, as many of you have noted, to all the other ministries that are dealing with this issue and are ignoring the issue in some cases. And it's a particular challenge because, of course, we know that ultimately the parties, governments will decide. And if the solutions aren't more holistic within government, then the positions certainly won't be. So that's certainly a concern. Simplicity, underlined, emphasized by all of you, and the sort of sense that policymaking is really, and DSI in this case, I mean, we're not looking for perfection, we're looking for practical, real change or outcomes that are largely acceptable. In terms of simplicity, building on that, not just simplicity, but efficiency, in the sense that, you know, costs and benefits, there's a reasonable balance in that context. Capacity development, technology transfer, they're important components of, I think, I heard, of a solution. Certainly that's my view, but they may not necessarily address the entire expectations and concerns of all the stakeholders. Again, options are not mutually exclusive, and you've made that clear. Scaling, I thought, was interesting in terms of rollout and in terms of policy making and implementation. Scaling is an interesting concept, and not often, in my experience, actually not often said or even thought about. So I thought that's kind of an interesting take home as well. The central most important divergence, I guess, remains not necessarily divergence, but I think maybe from the stakeholders standpoint, but not necessarily the panelists, is you know, in the monetary benefits of commercial users that they derive from the use of DSI, and how we actually go about constructing something or ensuring that something is fair and equitable. Equitable was a phrase, a word employed by a number of us, not just me. And I thought that's interesting, a very, very important context. And transparency as well, being important. And I rather liked, and I think it's actually very important, the reminder by a number of the panelists about environment as, I think, Henri, you suggested that environment as a stakeholder. And I thought that's it's a powerful concept, and it's not one that's very much employed, certainly in international affairs. And it's a shortcoming in my mind. It has been in the CBD. And again, it's the question of, who represents the environment, as we all represent our own interests or human interests. So it's interesting, and I think goes back in some ways to the worldview of many indigenous peoples, and a holistic view of the world where there isn't the Western concept of separation between us and them, between nature and ourselves. And I think that's a very integrative way of looking at things. And it's also a way to actually define solutions where things are not mutually exclusive. I thought that's an important point to keep in mind. And that may seem very distant from DSI, but actually in terms of the ultimate policy objective, I think it's a very powerful and very, very relevant idea. So on that note, I will turn to the ABS Capacity Development Initiative for some final housekeeping and some important words. Sue-El, my friend.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Tim. Thanks all the panelists. And I really, as we are quoting here, it's a quoting session almost. I loved very much what Margot said. So it helped to trigger thinking about we should think about. And this is definitely very inspiring, this session, and it will be taken into consideration. Also, the Q&A session was a very lively one, a very constructive one, I must say. And also these aspects are to be taken up and integrated as much as possible in the further deliberations of the ABS initiative. And maybe to just show you what we have in mind. I hope that you can see now this the screen. We have some upcoming activities towards what we call a second global dialogue on digital sequence information that should feed into the working group 3. Here we are considering a setup that addresses then also the different time zones. So that time zone specific Chatham House exchange that can then invitation based further chew on the different options, the points for consideration, and also priorities that should feed into the working group 3. So on that we will announce in due time how and when this is going to happen. So far it's July, that it should end by July, so June, July. And it should be preceded by some thematic webinars that pick up on issues that we learned are of importance. So IPRs, the interlinkage of IPRs and DSI. What's the state of play at WIPO, for example? IPLCs and TKs to provide a stage also for this commercial use related to the creation and use of DSI. Also, maybe then the question of the interface between digital sequence information, the Cartagena protocol, and synthetic biology, as we've seen today in the in the chat that this was also an issue where some thought that further exchange and deliberations would be necessary. I think it would be nice also to see who actually attended today, and maybe Yannick, thanks a lot. I hope you can see now on your screens. This is the result of the polls we have organized. So we do see a regional balance here. So basically all continents did participate. There is a bit of maybe also due to time and internet connection, a little bit of a weight to Western Europe, but it's also good to see Asia Pacific, night owls and early risers in Latin America, the Caribbean were also attending. Good to see is that the stakeholder group that will negotiate and at the CBD level, further the question of DSI is broadly represented, as we see government and government organizations, but also the key stakeholders, as we learned today: academia, collections, museums, private sector, and then also those that are facilitating and advising the process, as we see civil society organizations, IGOs, and so on. And I'm sure that we need to work more on an integration of indigenous peoples and local communities, which is unfortunately a bit underrepresented. The next poll, please, Yannick?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I think this is also quite interesting to see this question. Okay, who actually, in which, are there science policy processes ongoing in the countries of the attendees? And obviously it is an issue, and it is a highly debated issue. So that's interesting. So even at country level, there are exchanges, and we hope that we were able to feed a little bit into that, and that many of those who attended this webinar are actively or an advisory function are involved in these processes. We also have the none of the above. Those were probably just for the pleasure of watching it here and having attended. To close, I would like to once again thank all our panelists and also, of course, the facilitator, our donors of the ABS initiative. And so if you want to dig a little bit deeper into the contextual information on DSI, we have produced an introductory guide. We have a little whiteboard video, DSI Simply Explained. Many of the options have been discussed, elaborated at the first Pretoria dialogue, a multi-stakeholder and Chatham House dialogue that took place in November 2019. There are the reports and videos of the previous webinars, and just to make you a bit curious, we are in the last steps of studies that are in the making on options and challenges with respect to bilateral DSI regulations, and also some insights, aspects on commercial use of DSI that will then feed into the outlined informal process of the initiative, and hopefully also others, to spark more thinking and to help further triggering what we need to think about. I think that's it. We are 4 minutes over time, and once again, thanks a lot to have participated.